I am Emily Buss, and excuse me, I am a faculty member at the law school serving as the moderator for this series. One of the law school's important areas of academic research and clinical advocacy has been policing and police reform. Excuse me, I've had a little bit of an IT glitch there, as I'm sure you heard. The goal of this series is to give our faculty the opportunity to share their work and to give our community the chance to discuss how these ideas relate to current efforts to reform policing. The sessions are designed to allow considerable time for questions that can inspire future research to address issues that you help us to identify. This week's session focuses on police culture, training, and unions. And today's speakers are Marianne Case and Richard McAdams. I will introduce each speaker, after which the speaker will have roughly 12 minutes to speak. At approximately 12:30, we will turn to questions. Please send me any questions you have as soon as you have them by chat. I will do my best to ask as many of your questions as we can get to, with a focus on those most related to today's topic. I am pleased to begin today's discussion by introducing our first speaker, Marianne Case. Marianne Case is the Arnold I. Schur Professor of Law. She teaches subjects as diverse as feminist jurisprudence, constitutional law, regulation of sexuality, family law, sex discrimination, religious freedom, and European legal systems. She is the convener of our workshop on regulating family, sex, and gender. Her scholarship has focused on the regulation of sex, gender, sexuality, religion, and the family, and on the early history of feminism. She has also written about police violence from a feminist perspective since as long ago as the mid-1990s. Examples of her work include Police Mistakes in Ferguson Involve Gender as Well as Race, The Forgotten Lessons of Los Angeles' Christopher Commission, and Gender Performance Requirements of the U.S. Military in the War on Islamic Terrorism, which addresses toxic masculinity and the militarization of policing. Her articles related to policing have been posted to chat, or I will post them, I should say. I need to repost those to chat, so I will post those in the chat. Welcome, Marianne.
So I'm delighted to be here. What I am not delighted about is to find myself literally repeating recommendations that were made by the people I'll talk to you about in the mid-1990s, precisely to deal with police violence, initially in a quite different context also of national significance, which is the unrest in LA following the acquittal of the police in the aftermath of their beating of Rodney King. And just put this in context for me, I am, as Emily mentioned, a feminist theorist, among other things. One of the things that I have focused on in my feminist theory is gender discrimination. That is, discrimination in favor of or against qualities coded masculine or feminine, sometimes inflected by and sometimes irrespective of whether the person exhibiting them is male or female. One of these qualities is, for example, aggressiveness or assertiveness, and that's going to be one that I'm going to be focusing on. So I started looking at the results of the Christopher Commission, which is the commission headed by Warren Christopher, the former Secretary of State, not to look at gender discrimination in the policing, but to look at excessive use of force by the police and asking what causes this and what can we do to prevent it. What interested me at the time in the mid-1990s is that the Christopher Commission, again, simply interested in good policing, pointed out that one of the major problems was that the job of police officer had been defined in purely male and masculine terms. So police officers were recruited from things like the military, and the Christopher Commission said, no, you should instead be recruiting social workers. They were valued for their aggressiveness and assertiveness, and the Christopher Commission said, no, you should be evaluating themselves instead for their communication skills. So not only was the job defined as masculine, it was also heavily male. It remains heavily male. Sonia Starr has told me 88% of cops these days remain male. And part of the Christopher Commission looked at the ways in which female cops, at least in LA, tended to have fewer of the problems the Christopher Commission was charged with looking into. They were a much lower percentage than their percentage of the police force in complaints of excessive force and in other similar sorts of complaints. They seemed to be able, even though they were, less tall, less brawny, to control suspects without the use of force. Now, or at least use of excessive force. Now, some feminists, including a panel that went before the Los Angeles City Council, said, great, the solution is let's hire more women. And I'm all for more women in policing, but I again want to stress that, like the Christopher Commission, I was focused not on the sex, but of the gender of policing. That is to say, both males and females can exhibit these classically feminine qualities and cannot be prompted to exhibit to excess the classically masculine qualities that the Christopher Commission identified. I turned back to this when the Ferguson incident occurred. And what I was sorry to see was that the lessons of the Christopher Commission, although they had uptake in places like LA, and one of the things I discovered was that in the same week as Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the LAPD had a similar incident that they were able to diffuse with community support. I don't want to say that the LAPD has solved all its problems. I do, though, want to repeat that the recommendations we are hearing now are recommendations we have been hearing since the mid-1990s, and there should have been uptake on them since then, and I hope there is uptake on this now. One of the things that interrupted such uptake as there had been between the 90s and Ferguson was the ripple effects of the war on terror. And we've seen some of this in terms of the militarization of the police, the way in which they've gotten surplus expensive weaponry from the military itself, and then have found reasons, I want to say excuses, to acquire and use it. But it's also the case that people who study this much more centrally as part of their scholarly program than I said that the lessons of community policing, for example, were lost in the war on terror. And we returned to exactly the model that the Christopher Commission and I criticize, which is that the cop is this big, beefy guy with a gun whose job is to be aggressive and thereby to control people. And I've written separately about the way in which that doesn't even work for the military itself. And I want to leave as much time for questions as possible, so I've got a lot more to say. So I want to turn to the ways in which I'm worried about some aspects of the so-called defund the police movement as it intersects with this notion of the gendering of police. So when I hear the defund the police movement talk as some people involved in, including my former colleague in University of Chicago Law School graduate Tracy Mears, put this in terms of more specialization for the police. And even more so when I read about the more detailed proposals that say we should be hiving off from the work of the police, work that should be done by social workers and psychologists to deal with the mentally disabled or domestic violence institutes. I'm not in principle opposed to this. I have the following concern, which is that the last thing it seems to be desirable is to further reinforce the notion that the job of the police officer is to be aggressive and masculine and wielding of force. And I worry that that more specialization of the police along these male-masculine lines will not solve the problem. Now, I'm all for defunding the police in the sense of not having them spend money, way much more than they should, and possibly what they should be spending is zero on military hardware. I'm certainly in favor of hiring and using more social workers and mental health professionals. But I worry that if the job of the police is now segregated out from these activities, that's even more dangerous, especially given that there are circumstances where you cannot tell what level of force is going to be required. So I would like to, in addition to this defunding and spending money on other things, have the police themselves better trained in exactly the skill set that the Christopher Commission forwarded. Now, the problem is that police culture and police unions, about which Richard McAdams will talk to you, heavily resist this. A terrible counterexample is Minneapolis, exactly the eye of the storm, or the center of this storm, because of George Floyd. A year or more ago, the Minneapolis police stopped its so-called warrior training program. And what happened was that the head of the police union said, well, the city's not going to pay for this anymore, but we will pay for any cop to get this who wants it. And that seems to me not a helpful way to what I hope will finally happen after 25, 30 or more years of this recommendation, realizing that cops should be not devaluing feminine skills like communication skills, but should be acquiring them and using them in their everyday work. I'll stop there. Emily, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. I don't seem to be muted now. Is there a...
You unmuted yourself.
That's excellent. Okay. Sorry all for these glitches that I'm having. Very pleased to introduce Richard McAdams, who many of you surely recognize because he is also a co-convener, co-organizer of this series, and he moderated last week's session. Richard is the Bernard D. Meltzer Professor of Law and recently finished a 2-year term as the law school's deputy dean. Professor McAdams writes on criminal law and procedure, on
Well, we seem to have lost Emily. I am the former deputy dean and the Bernard D. Meltzer Professor of Law. I've been here at the law school since 2007, and I write on criminal law related topics mostly, and that's what I teach: criminal law, criminal procedure. And so I wanted to talk about two of the topics for today: culture and police unions. About culture, I thought I would begin just by referencing a paper I wrote with Professor Dharmapala, who spoke 2 weeks ago. And this relates to what Professor Case has just said. We wrote a paper in which we looked to an economics paper by Canis Prendergast, who's here at Booth. And economists were interested in what motivates people who work for government agencies when the agency is, of course, not trying to make a profit. And the answer might be obvious to everyone but economists, but he said it could be that people are sometimes intrinsically motivated to do a job. And so the fact that their salary isn't immediately adjusted as it would be in a for-profit firm based on their productivity may not mean they're completely unproductive because they have intrinsic reasons to do their job. And Prendergast actually, to illustrate his idea, two of his examples were social workers and police. He said, the kind, and the point was that people self-select into a job based on what the job is. So the kind of people who self-select into social work jobs are different than those who self-select into policing. So Professor Dharmapal and I took this idea. We tried to ask, well, what kind of people would become police? If you ask people why they become police, a lot of them will say to help people. But there are a lot of jobs that if you want to help people, you might get. You might become a social worker, a physical therapist, a mental health worker, a teacher, a life coach, a publicist, lots of things in which you can think you help people. What is it that you get if you are a police officer that is rather unique? And the answer is that you get to facilitate the punishment of suspected wrongdoers. And in some cases, police inflict some punishment of suspected wrongdoers themselves. So it could be that, you know, it turns out that it's a very human thing to have preferences for the punishment of wrongdoers according to a large empirical literature, but the preferences vary in intensity from person to person. So our model suggested that those who are attracted to policing would be, on average, have more intense preferences for punishment than the average citizen. And there was nothing special about punitiveness. You could pick some other characteristic that is about the job. For example, the fact that you enforce rules, or the fact that you are sometimes called upon to engage in violence. And so if those things, can you raise your hand if you still hear me?
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I've switched computers. So our claim was that you know, there would be these systematic differences between the people who self-select into the job of policing and the average citizen, and that I think is consistent with, you know, what Marianne was saying. If you design the job, the final point is, you know, there's some very good re-examination going on right now about what we should ask police to do. But if what we ask them to do is less and less of the, you know, of the helping behavior of the and simply strip the job down to its most you know, violent components, then that might have an effect on a future effect on who's attracted to the job. So I think that is it's understandable that we think about whether we need the police to do certain things, but it does worry me slightly if the remaining police job just becomes one in which you expect to engage in violence every day, because that's the only thing left for the police to do. That was one of 2 points I wanted to make about police culture. The other point that hasn't been mentioned yet in this series, but has to be mentioned, is what is called the code of silence. The best evidence that police have a nearly unique culture is to see how loyal they are to other police. Police are loyal, more loyal to police than they are to the people they are supposed to serve. To use very positive words to describe it, the police have solidarity. They enjoy group cohesion. These are cultural characteristics that most social groups strive for. Many occupations and workplaces enjoy some degree of in-group loyalty. When I was younger, it used to be said, or at least I would hear it be said, that there was a code of silence among doctors, and that meant that competent doctors would cover up for the mistakes of incompetent doctors. Every occupation may favor its own to some degree, but I don't hear that said much these days about a code of silence among doctors. One does hear that said about the police, and I think with very good reason. The police sense of loyalty towards other police is intense. Police support police, and that means the police do not report the misconduct of other police. In fact, it is a grave violation of the police code of honor to cooperate with an investigation into police wrongdoing. Now, these are hard points to make empirically with quantitative evidence. And for today, I'm just going to offer you 3 examples that I think are fairly typical. One is about Joe Crystal in 2012. Joe Crystal was a detective in Baltimore, and one day he observed 2 police officers near him chasing a suspect. And the suspect was running down a row of row houses, and at some point, to get away, turns and kicks in the front door of a row house and runs in it. The 2 officers go in. He watches them very shortly leave with the suspect handcuffed, get in their squad car and drive away. Very strangely, a few minutes later, the squad car reappears and the 2 officers leave the squad car, and they have the suspect who's handcuffed with them, and they take the suspect back into the row house. And this, I think, gets his attention. And a few minutes later, a 4th police officer, another police officer, arrives and goes into the row house. And when the suspect is brought out, he is badly beaten. And what apparently happened was that the row house that this suspect randomly kicked in belonged to and was occupied by a girlfriend of a police officer. And so when the man was removed from her house, she called her boyfriend, told him what happened. He called the police who had the suspect and said, take him back to the apartment so he could go over there and administer a beating. This was something Joe Crystal didn't sit well with Joe Crystal. He talked to his sergeant. His sergeant told him not to get involved, not to say anything. He went to the state's attorney anyway, and that began a dramatic turn in his career. Other officers would stop, backing him up when he called for backup. He got called that, people wouldn't talk to him. They shunned him. He found a dead rat on his windshield. And eventually, after a couple of years, having been a fairly on the fast track, he resigned. He was, in a sense, forced out of the police department for breaking the code of silence. That's a fairly typical case. I feel like I have to mention Adrian Schoolcraft from New York City. Almost typical case, but as a New York City police officer, he started secretly recording the precinct roll calls in 2009. And this was in Brooklyn. It was at a time when there was a lot of stop and frisks in New York. And he felt that there was pressure to make arrests. There were arrest quotas, and that was causing a lot of false arrests. And the city was officially denying that they were doing that. And so he wanted to complain about it, but he thought he needed evidence. So he started wearing a recording, and he also recorded some evidence that his superiors were manipulating crime statistics in various ways to suit political ends. He started complaining. This did not go well. Eventually, the police, found out that he had recordings. And what makes this case worthy of mention among many that I'm not going to mention is what the police did next. With some fairly flimsy excuse that they were concerned about his mental well-being, they showed up at his apartment. They entered, without, they didn't, they let themselves in, and they called an ambulance and had him committed to a psychiatric hospital. He was in there for 6 days when eventually his father, a former police officer, found him and got him out. Again, he eventually quit the force. Here in Chicago, we've had a number of cases like this. I will just mention one. I'll mention the names of the officers, Shannon Spalding and Danny Echeverria. The case is rather complex, but the city of Chicago settled a whistleblowing lawsuit for $2 million with them in 2016. They were effectively drummed out of the force with bad assignments and indirect threats of violence because they wouldn't stop pursuing a public housing officer, Sergeant Ronald Watts, who they suspected of shaking down drug dealers and basically being a drug dealer himself. He was eventually convicted and terminated, but part of their offense
to the code of silence was in going to the FBI and not trusting the internal investigators in Chicago. The city settled because the judge on the eve of trial ruled that the plaintiff officers would be allowed to call Mayor Rahm Emanuel to testify. The mayor had given a speech in 2015 in which he had decried and admitted to the existence of the code of silence, a code the city preferred to deny. And so they were going to call Rahm Emanuel, put him on the stand and say, what is the basis of your saying there is a code of silence among the police in your city? And so then the case settled for $2 million. So these are, I think, somewhat dramatic examples when compared to other public employees that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure that, like I say, all occupations may tend to try to, have a bias towards people in the same occupation, but these are rather dramatic cases. I will not try to answer the question right now. Why are the police so successful at enforcing a code of silence compared to other occupations or professions? I think that's a question worth exploring. But let me move on now to a subject that could be related, I guess, but it's not, I'm not offering it as the answer, but it's the other subject for today, which is police unions. Most American police are unionized. I believe there are only 5 states that don't allow police officers to engage in collective bargaining, and almost all big cities have unionized police. Many things that police unions do are basically the same as what every public employee union does. They attempt to protect the job security of their members. Police unions, however, seem to be remarkably effective. Part of the effect is through the terms of the collective bargaining agreement that the union negotiates with the government, usually a local government, and part of it is through lobbying for legislation. So many states have something called a law enforcement officer bill of rights. Some cities have this by ordinance or the executive order of the mayor, and in many cases, the terms are in the collective bargaining agreement. What kind of terms? Provisions that disqualify misconduct complaints that are submitted too many days after an incident, or that if an investigation takes too long to complete. In Illinois, for example, there can be no anonymous complaints. It has to be accompanied by an affidavit, which is understandable in some ways, but undoubtedly deters a lot of legitimate grievances. A second point is that these terms prevent police officers from being interrogated immediately after being involved in an incident, or otherwise restricting how, when, or why they can be interrogated. Professor Huck and I wrote an article a few years ago about the specific problems of delay. We call them delay privileges. So, for example, in some cities, there can be days or weeks that have to pass before a police officer involved in a shooting can be interviewed about what happened and why he did what he did. In Chicago, it's a 24-hour period. This is not a sort of normal practice of investigation to wait to ask a person. It seems like it might be useful if you were trying to allow people to get their story straight, as opposed to just say what happened. The Department of Justice under the Obama administration investigated the Chicago police. And here's a detail I found really amazing as a lawyer. If you study any kind of legal process, think about this. When they did interview people, they would record what was being said, and the officer would have the right and would have a lawyer or a union rep there. And the officer would be asked a question. They would be entitled to say, let me take a break after any question and talk to my representative. That representative, of course, was entitled to talk to other police who were being asked about the same incident. So here's the surprise. The surprise is that when they asked for a break and they turned off the recording, they made no note on the recording of the fact that they were turning off the recording. And when they turned it back on, they made no note of how long it had been off. So, I mean, I don't have a case like this, but I can just hypothesize a case where you ask a question like, so the person had a knife, did they have the knife in their left hand or their right hand? And then, you know, what turns out is there's a 45-minute break before, you know, the answer is in the left hand, you know, which is very meaningful if in fact there's the opportunity to kind of get your story straight rather than just say what you know. So there are lots of ways in which the procedures are more friendly towards the police than I think to any other kind of suspect being interrogated. I'll just say very briefly, you know, these provisions give officers access to information that citizens generally don't get prior to being investigated. In Florida, for example, the state law, that's the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, says that you're supposed to give the officer being investigated all the information you have, all the witness statements, all photographs, everything before you ask them questions. Also, you are supposed to let the officer go last. So you're supposed to have interviewed every other officer and then give them all this information so that then they could tell a story that would be consistent. This is not something we do with people in general. As an interrogator and investigator, you want to sort of catch people before they can get their story straight and ask them and pin them down. But we do everything, these provisions do everything to avoid that.
Richard, I'm going to jump in and
disciplinary consequences, and in particular, allowing the police to arbitrate the city's decision to sanction them or fire them. So the city goes through all sorts of process. You know, the investigation is very difficult. In the end, they decide the officer is guilty of something and they want to fire him. And then there's arbitration. And a very substantial number of times, the arbitrator sides with the officer and says, yeah, this was really bad, but instead of firing them, you should have just suspended them for 3 days or something like that.
Richard, I'm jumping in to tell you your time. Can you hear me, Richard? Richard?
The empirical literature is thin, but I will mention my paper with a different paper with Professor Dharmapala and Rappaport, and this is my conclusion. We tried to measure the effects of police unions on behavior. And so technically we measured the effect of law enforcement officers acquiring a right to engage in collective bargaining. And we did this by examining the effect of a 2003 decision by the Florida Supreme Court, allowing sheriff's deputies to engage in collective bargaining for the first time. And we compared a measure of violent misconduct before and after 2003, but we also compared the sheriff's deputies to police officers in the state. The police officers acted as a kind of control for this experiment because they were unaffected by the Florida Supreme Court decision. They had the right to unionize before and after 2003. The sheriff's deputies had no right before, but had a right after. So we compared changes in violence among the deputies to changes in violence among the police. And we found, in the end, an increase in violent misconduct on the order of 40% after the 2003 decision. So I do worry that unions may be making the problem worse.
Okay, am I audible? Can people hear me? Nod if you can. Okay, so we ran over. I tried to do some interrupting unsuccessfully, and I also apologize that I disappeared for a while. This is the challenges of Zoom, and I am not the most IT proficient person. So apologies for any frustration you have. Please blame it all on me. But I want to make sure that we use our remaining time as well as we can for questions and discussion. And I want to say a lot of the questions, and I have had help getting the questions through things like text because I lost chat as well. So another challenge. So please feel free to send a question again if you feel like it's not being asked. A lot of the questions focus on, like, each of the speakers seems to embrace change. What are the models? Where has there been successful change that we can look to and learn from? And I'd like to hear from both of you, because I think for both topics and the combination, of course, overlap of the topics, I got many versions of that question. So where there has been change, clearly there needs to be change. Where has it, what do we learn from those successes? Marianne, you want to start?
Okay, so my line was also dropped. It's one of the reasons I spoke as briefly as I did. I mean, I wish I could say, here's the success story. I think part of my message is there is such an ingrained valuing of male masculine behaviors above all, that any attempt to displace them is seen as devaluing them. And any attempt to substitute or increase female feminine behaviors is seen as, weak and not to be embraced by manly men. I mean, I've written as well about interrogation techniques and the way in which harsh interrogation techniques, which any expert on interrogation will have told you since at least the middle of the 20th century, the World War II period, are less effective than gentler techniques, were nevertheless embraced in the War on Terror because, and my article, forgive the language here, because we don't want to look like a bunch of pussies. And the idea that what works is to be despised because it will make you look like a pussy is exactly the problem with a focus on gender in the way in which gender is linked with sex. Men don't want to look like women. Men despise women more often than they should, and therefore they despise what is associated with women, which is something that is gendered feminine. And things like cooperation, gentle interrogation techniques, social work have historically in this culture been associated with women and have suffered thereby, even when they have proven effectiveness. So I'm sorry, I can't give you an example of how this has worked well, other than the one I already mentioned, which is in the editorial that's published online. One of the things I note is that the LAPD itself, the target of the Christopher Commission, said, we're not having these problems in Ferguson because we listened to the Christopher Commission.
Okay, so do we know anything about what happened in LA that allowed them to overcome what you're suggesting are sort of only possibly unovercomable problems? What's the trick? What do they do?
They took the recommendations seriously. And they spent 20 years apparently working on building community support. But again, part of my pessimistic message is even in places where this was working, the testimony of police chiefs is that the War on Terror set it back.
Richard, many questions, some version of how do we get at the code of silence? Looks like among doctors there has been a real shift in a positive, appropriate direction. What do we learn from that? Are there examples where there has been success that we should be learning from?
I'm sorry, I don't have some great example of, this medium-sized American city did the following 5 things, and then, basically have a model police force now. I think I should first say that all of us should keep in mind, I just engaged in a bunch of generalizations about policing in the United States, but we should all keep in mind that there are about 700,000 general purpose law enforcement officers in the United States who belong to over 15,000 general law enforcement agencies in the United States, because our policing is mostly local. We have those thousands of them. So I always try to remind myself that if 50 or 100 or 500 law enforcement agencies are the ones that are in the paper because of a misuse of force, I don't know, like, is that because all of the 12,000 agencies are behaving like that, or are we just aware of the ones that are? So maybe there are some, so I don't know as much as I would like. This is kind of a research agenda for me, but maybe there are some departments out there that we don't hear about because they're pretty good. They've adopted, and what makes them different, I suspect, is no one thing. I suspect it's like 15 things. It has to do with who they hire, how they train them, how they discipline them, what their ability to fire them is, how they retrain them and motivate them, and a bunch of other things. So at the margins, there are, I do think that this work that I was talking about should inform some policies. I think as recently as a few months ago, Congress was considering, there was some bipartisan support for a bill that would compel all American municipalities to collectively bargain with police. The Democrats saw this as a pro-union measure, and I think the Republicans saw it as a pro-police measure. I think that's dead for now, and my thought is, well, good. I don't see why we necessarily want more. I mean, we mostly it's just a few states that don't allow them. So I'm not sure there was that much at stake.
We did have a question, Richard, about those 5 states that don't allow. Just which states are they was part of the question, but also maybe that's what do we learn from the states that don't allow collective bargaining? What looks different? What doesn't look different? Do we know?
Well, so working with Dhamika Dharmapala and John Rappaport and I, we started several years ago thinking, let's do some kind of empirical work on policing, which, I was not previously an empiricist, and I have to say I've learned a lot about how much labor is involved in trying to do something like this. So we thought about that question. Maybe we should study the difference between the 5 states that don't have any police unions and the 45 states that do. But, just in terms of empirical confidence, that's a very hard thing to do, because there's all sorts of ways that those 5 states differ from the other 45 states. And so even if you find, for example, and I don't know that it's true, but even if you find there's fewer complaints about police or fewer shootings of people by police in those 5 states, could you attribute it to the lack of unionization? That would be a very perilous thing to do, because, like I say, maybe the same political forces that block unionization for police also have some other effects on police, and it's not about unions. So we wound up doing what we did in Florida, and that certainly gives me some hesitation about more unionization of policing.
So maybe I'll turn this into a little bit of a shout out to everybody listening. I mean, I know people all come with their own particulars, localized knowledge to some extent, and to the extent that any people are aware of things that are going on that bear on these themes in particular jurisdictions, I think that it would be really interesting to include that in the mix of the information that we're receiving. Camden is getting a lot of positive attention. I don't know if that's even fair, and if it really bears at all on issues that either of you are addressing. Have either of you sort of scrutinized the Camden experience? Camden, New Jersey, to be clear.
I am aware of it from nothing more detailed than newspaper articles, and would hesitate to say something on the basis of that little knowledge.
So one question asked you, and maybe particularly Marianne, to address the comparative issue. To the extent the picture of policing and policing behavior in the United States looks different than it does elsewhere, and I'm generalizing to reflect the generalization of the question, what accounts for that distinction?
So I am most familiar with policing in Western Europe, and in particular Germany, where I've done work. The major difference I would highlight is the amount of training policing receive, the amount of education and then the amount of training in the job. So police are far better educated, and they spent 3 years, where the maximum in the United States, Richard can correct me on this, is a year, and sometimes it's an awful lot less, learning the job, including learning the aspects of the job that are gendered feminine, like the psychological aspects of the job. And in the United States, we have not only not thought it necessary for police to get that kind of training, but there are even these horrible cases where it is not thought that the police should be that smart. There was litigation in which people with who scored particularly well on tests like IQ tests were denied the opportunity to become police officers, and they sued about it. And the reaction of the courts was, it's okay. It can sometimes be reasonable to say, no, we don't want the brightest bulbs in the room. We want people who are going to be possibly more go along and get along. And the problem is that may be fine if the culture you're getting along with and going along with is a good culture, but it can also socialize people into a bad culture, a brutal culture, a culture of silence.
Richard, anything on the comparative question?
Well, I just sent a link to an article that Barack Obama tweeted about a few days ago, which was about Germany and the stark differences in how they train police and how long they train police, like Marianne said, and the case in the United States. And apparently their police behave very differently, but it's again, I don't know what the hard empirical evaluation is, but the article does say something like they shot and killed 11 people in a recent year. For the year, they have a population 1/4 the size of the United States. So if you multiply that by 4, that would be 44 police shooting deaths a year. We have over 1,000 police. I'm not just counting shooting, I guess, but it's almost all shooting. We have 1,000 a year. So, somebody would then say, well, you should control for the crime rate. If the violent crime rate here is higher, then it's probably understandable that police would be in more situations, and if criminals are armed more here. But I suspect that even if given the difference between 44 and 1,000, I suspect that even if you adjust it upward for the crime rate and for violent crime rate and for gun rates, that it's a pretty shocking difference in the amount of police violence. But when you I do want to say something. Let me try to answer this. What your prior question? Is there a way to get at the police code of silence? I don't have a magic bullet, but I do think that what we should pay an enormous amount of attention to, it's something easy to miss, is like when there's a police shooting and there's enormous attention on the shooter and making sure that an appropriate investigation occurs and where warranted, appropriate criminal prosecution, appropriate punishment occurs. Let's not lose sight of the other officers, if there are any, who lied about what happened. I mean, this happens in a lot of cases. It happened to Laquan McDonald, that the initial statement of the events is radically inconsistent with what turns out to be the case when you see the footage. And there was some effort to fire people here in Chicago, and that was part of, and some people resigned rather than go through that because they had flat out lied about what they saw. I think we have to take that super seriously. I think, the DOJ report on Chicago said at some point that no one is ever disciplined for apparently lying under oath in court. And the reason is that if they discipline them, this is the reason that the CPD gave. If we discipline people for lying under oath in court, defense lawyers in subsequent cases would use that to discredit the police officer in future cases. So we would be ruining that police officer's career by admitting that they had lied. Now, so that's exactly what they should be doing. right? They should be saying they lied and their career is ruined. So maybe you want to retire because you're never going to get promoted because you're not going to be able to be a detective if you're not credible on the stand. I think all I can say is if we took telling the truth more seriously, that would make it a little harder to maintain the code of silence.
Can I also add on the code of silence the following? Donald Trump has not come up in this discussion thus far. I'm going to bring him in. I'm going to say the message from the top is extraordinarily important. That goes to the first of what I said, the brutality versus the softer techniques. And famously, Trump said, you know, don't be so gentle with them when you're pushing them into the car. If they hit their head, there's no problem. I think analogies between the performance of our police in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military in Iraq and Afghanistan, when they were largely performing policing functions in those countries, and the police in the United States are underexplored, and I would like to see more of them. But on the issue of code of silence, you need to protect and reward the people who do come forward to rat on their compatriots when their compatriots are seriously misbehaving. And one of the things Trump has done is severely undercut people in the military, including in the elite special forces, who came up and bravely testified against their compatriots who were then charged with war crimes. And what Trump did was pardon, stop prosecutions of, promote, give or restore awards to the people that their own colleagues said were misbehaving, and misbehaving is an understating word, were engaged in war crimes. So instead of the whistleblowers being rewarded, the people who were behaving so badly, their own loyal colleagues turned on them and reported them, were the ones rewarded.
So, Marianne, believe it or not, I find optimism in some of your last comments. First is the suggestion that leadership matters. And we had a question, which is, and I'd like to hear from both of you, sort of how is leadership in a police force chosen? To whom are they accountable? Where, to what extent is there an opportunity for change through that leadership? But I also heard optimism just to acknowledge that, you suggest that Germany does a lot better because they do a lot of good training. So maybe we shouldn't lose hope, because training is something that we certainly can do. But let's hear briefly from either or both of you about this question of leadership, to the extent that these forces are, it's very important who's leading them.
Before the question of leadership, the question of optimism. I mean, I am pessimistic.
I didn't ask that as a question.
I know, I understand, but I'm pessimistic about implementation. But what I want to highlight is what makes me pessimistic is that, and by all accounts, apparently great solution has been on the table for a generation, for 25 or 30 years. My pessimism is about its lack of implementation. I'm still optimistic that if we were to manage to implement it, it would do what it was promised to do by the Christopher Commission, make things much, much better.
So I'll interject in another way. I just know from other areas of policy that I've worked in, there are surely police chiefs, police commission, whatever the titles are, leaders somewhere in some of these jurisdictions who agree with absolutely everything that's been said and want to make this kind of change. And so the question, I'd be interested to know sort of what that experience is. If there are not such examples, I think people haven't identified those examples. The question would be sort of how do you build leadership that will, be other examples of such people who have the insights that you're describing here to make a difference.
I think the answer is yes. I wish I could remember the name of this police chief I want to praise, but there was someone a few years ago, before, like maybe 5 years ago, was seen kneeling, and it was a small or medium-sized city in the West, as I recall, and he was kneeling with Black Lives Matter protesters, and he came in and apparently had a very strong view about the need to justify the use of force, which didn't just mean firing your gun, but drawing your gun, and the there was some anecdotal evidence based on decline in shooting in that city that he had an effect. So I don't, and like I say, there are thousands of departments we never hear anything about, and it may be we don't hear about them because they're being run reasonably well. I just can't generalize about departments I don't know anything about, and so I do think leadership plays a role. At the same time, I guess I am pessimistic about very large police forces in cities like Chicago or New York. They are like giant bureaucracies. And if we're going to bring up Donald Trump, I guess I'll say, Donald Trump learned that the federal government is a series of giant bureaucracies, and it's a little bit difficult to turn the ship. Given how many people there are doing different things. And I think that people who are police chiefs who are brought in to sort of fix the department find that there's this powerful institutional culture that has been there a long time, and people have this attitude of, we were here before you got here, we'll be here after you're gone. It's just extremely difficult to do anything. This is why, you brought up Camden. I don't know how well Camden succeeded, but the idea of a hard restart of a particular department strikes me as entirely plausible thing we should be thinking about. It doesn't, like anything else, it might not work. Mostly I think in terms of lots of smaller reforms, use of force reforms, training reforms, the ability to discipline police and investigate police more effectively. But for some large police departments that have successfully resisted reform through a series of scandals, I am pessimistic. I'm more optimistic at this moment than perhaps I've been in a long time, but I'm still ultimately pessimistic that very large police departments that have this ingrained culture can be turned around by a change at the top or a bunch of reforms. I still want to try all of that. I'm not saying therefore give up on those reforms, but I just think maybe a hard reset for some departments is something to seriously consider.
All right, and with that, we are out of time for today. I want to thank both of our presenters and for all of you participating. Next week, the focus of the discussion will be on hiring, certification, and use of force policies. So it follows quite naturally from this discussion. And we welcome any kind of contributions that you want to make to the extent that you know examples out there that are sort of worthy examples that we could all learn from. And wish you well until next week. Thanks very much.